I've always said, and what I found from most wealthy people that I hang around is that we love to spend money, but we hate to waste money. Welcome to the Kingspiration Podcast. This is the place where you'll learn how to get unstuck and gain momentum in your life and business. Each week, we tackle the real aspects of entrepreneurship, personal development, relationships, and fitness. I'm your co-host, Ethan King, from Atlanta, Georgia, USA, entrepreneur, TEDx speaker, and best-selling author of Wealth Beyond Money.
And I'm your co-host, Justin King, no relation to Ethan, from Cape Town, South Africa, entrepreneur, speaker, and business growth strategist. Our journey crosses continents and cultures, sharing wisdom and experiences to propel you forward. Welcome to Kingspiration. Let's start the conversation.
So, Justin, I've noticed here in the U.S., there seems to be, at least from my observation, a lot of price sensitivity in the marketplace from consumers. I'm more than in previous years. I'm noticing it in my business, in conversations with other people. The conversation tends to lean more towards, well, how much is it? And are there payment plans and things like that? Are you noticing any of that, like a spike in that in South Africa? Or is it about the same or what?
It's an interesting question. And the reality is, I don't think we notice it as much in South Africa. It definitely happens. But the reason I say we don't notice it as much is because that is generally just what we deal with in our economy and the way that we do, I'm going to say the way that we do business. There is and has always been price sensitivity. And I think that's had to do with the fact that our economy, I don't want to say it has always struggled, but our economy has always felt like it's been on a knife edge a lot of the time. So people are always sensitive around what do we or don't we spend money on. Mm. General population don't have a huge amount of disposable income. So the high earners or the percentage of people in South Africa that don't have to be too worried about what something costs is very, very small. So when you're addressing the majority of the market, the conversation is always going to end up, and this could be for any product or service, always going to end up in some way around price. So right now, yes, that's a conversation. But what has been interesting, Ethan, having sold services and products in South Africa and having to South Africans and having sold services and products to the US, the question I find comes up more often than not from South Africans rather than those in the US. And the prices that we would mention to locals, to people in South Africa, they might raise an eyebrow and be like, that's a lot of money. People in the US don't even bat an eyelid. So it's just such a big difference between what people, the value or the amount that people are willing to spend, where they peg the value that they're going to be receiving. In South Africa, you have to really convince people that there's going to be, and I'm not a huge fan of the term, an ROI on their spend, whatever it may be. So we do feel it, but I think not as much because it's just always been something that we've dealt with.
So that's interesting. So when you're doing business, because if someone is based in South Africa but has a global business, do you offer different pricing to someone in the US than you would to another local South African? Do you kind of hold two different sets of prices there?
Am I allowed? Should I let the cat out the bag? Absolutely, and that's pretty uniform. I was actually looking at a coaching organization. They're based in Switzerland. And they do, I want to call it coaching training. So they call it not integrity coaching, integral coaching. I don't know. The word will come to me now. But they've actually got a set of prices. So they're based in Switzerland, but the methodologies, they were originated in SA. They've got links to some US organizations as well. But on their website, they've got a price for people living and earning in Africa, and then they've got a price for the rest of the world. So that was interesting. And I was just looking at that the other day. And the majority
it's clearly posted. They're transparent with it.
Yeah, they're very transparent with it. And likewise, majority of businesses that are based in South Africa doing business with both South Africans and internationally, you would have a rand rate, and that same product or service would have a dollar or a pound or euro rate, which would be substantially higher. And it's not because you're trying to rip anybody off, just the ability for international people to spend is that much higher. And what's beautiful is we, as local businesses, we would be earning more than we would be able to get for that product or service locally. And as an international client, you're more than likely paying less, still paying less, than you would ordinarily for that service or that product if it had been delivered in the US, which is really, really interesting. So there's value to be had by all. And I'm really painting with a massively broad brush now, but you could probably double to triple prices South Africa, what that we would charge in South African rands to that which you would charge in US dollars and still be competitive or cheaper than what's being delivered in the US. It's crazy.
Interesting. So would that pricing just apply to South Africa or any country in Africa? Would you give them like at the continent of Africa pricing?
It's a very good question, and that I think is going to depend business by business. Very often, if you're based in South Africa, you will have a South Africa rand-based rate, and anything outside of South Africa, you will then start using a dollar-based rate because a lot of the African countries will use a dollar currency. Well, they'll do a lot of transactions in a dollar-based way. So you would offer a dollar rate, but slightly higher than your rand rate, but not necessarily as high as that which you would offer to US clients, as an example. I am doing a massively broad generalization. I have no doubt that somebody is listening thinking, that's definitely not what we do. I know these people don't do that. So I am generalizing. Obviously, there's a million different ways to do it. But that is what I have seen happens quite a bit.
Interesting. Okay.
But on this topic, though,
yeah,
it has got me thinking about, and this is a thought I've had quite a lot lately, is trying to understand the difference or making sure that in my mind I'm clear on the difference between when I say something is expensive versus it is a lot of money. So because expense, and I think we all default to that. We see the price of something and our automatic thought, if we do think it's a lot of money, we generally say that is expensive versus it's a lot of money. Expensive in my mind, and this is really what I'm trying to get myself to articulate more. Expensive would mean that it's not necessarily a fair exchange of value, because if it's expensive, then in my mind, the value that I'm receiving for the exchange of cash that I'm paying or money that I'm paying is out of sync somewhat, which would make it expensive. Versus,
so for that, I use the word overpriced.
Okay. Yeah. So where does expensive sit in your mind? Because I'm trying to think of, it's just a lot of money. So maybe a lot of money for me, but that doesn't mean that it's expensive, because as a value exchange, I'm getting good value for that money that I'm handing over. So overpriced is another good way to look at it. But what is expensive then?
So to me, I guess expensive is relative to the marketplace. So for example, a Lamborghini is an expensive car compared to most cars in the marketplace, Toyotas, Fords, all that kind of stuff, right? But I didn't say it was overpriced because it may be very much worth the dollar amount if you're into that, if you're passionate about it. Now, I don't know enough about cars, but that's the first example that came to my mind. I don't know anyone who, I know people who own Lamborghinis and Bentleys and Rolls Royces. I know people who own exotic cars, and I've never heard one of them say, oh, these are overpriced.
Yeah.
But everyone knows they're expensive. Yeah.
Yeah. I think you've got me to change my mind on my thought process around that. Expensive makes sense. And that's why people will say somebody has expensive taste. Or generally, at times, a wealthy individual has expensive taste. But not a lot of wealthy individuals, they count their pennies. So generally, they're not going to be purchasing things that are overpriced. But they will buy something that is expensive. I like the example that you use. That makes sense. That makes a lot of sense.
I've always said, and what I've found from most wealthy people that I hang around is that we love to spend money, but we hate to waste money. And it can be like, I mean, I know some people who are worth way, way more than I am. I mean, I know a guy is worth like $100 million, but he will get in an argument over $100 if he thinks that is unjustifiable, and really is a miser when it comes to pennies if he feels like they're being wasted. But he doesn't mind spending on lavish experiences, lavish, appointments for his home, things like that. And I've come to adopt that mindset as well. But I hate wasting money. I hate wasting money. I hate wasting time. But I certainly don't mind spending money on valuable things and spending time on valuable experiences.
I like it. So I think it's on a tangent there for a second. If I bring the conversation back, what do you think is currently driving the conversation around price sensitivity in the US?
Well, I think there's a combination of things. It's still all ripple effects from the pandemic economically, because I think we got this, it's such a myriad of things. We got this surge of money that the government gave out, stimulus checks. and people were able to stay home, had some extra cash. People got PPP loans forgiven in their businesses, things like that. So people around 2021, 22, pretty much people were flush with cash in the US. We hadn't been spending money on travel, so people's savings were way up. We were spending less, bringing in more, and we were really feeling good about ourselves because we were kind of past the worst part of the sickness part of the pandemic. But then, there's always ebbs and flows, right? There are consequences for that because the money you get, if you just print money, you got to pay for that somehow. So now we've had all this inflation, prices, everything is up. And you also have generally people are wanting to work less. The sentiment towards work has shifted a lot from the pandemic. I think people started to realize life is fragile, time is short. There are lots of things I want to do in my life, and working isn't one of them. So it's been hard to really get people to stick around in the office in most places. And in combination with that, they want more money. So we've had hikes in minimum wage. I just saw that a grocery store was offering $23 an hour. So if a grocery store is offering $23 an hour, that even if that's their ceiling, that the highest they'll pay, it still puts in people's minds, well, I could work at a grocery store and make $23 an hour. So now if you have a more established business that's more, prestigious than a grocery store, you can't be paying $23 an hour. You got to at least start 30, 35, 40. And these might be for entry-level positions. So that puts businesses in a bind because now businesses' expenses are way higher. So in order to survive, businesses have to increase price, but there's a lot of price sensitivity in the marketplace because everything costs more for consumers. It's just a mess we're in. I don't really know the answer to it. I don't think it comes down to just hiring the right politician. I think it's a complex solution that we're going to have to come to. Yeah. That's kind of what's going on.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Whenever you mention, I know you and I have spoken about that minimum wage before. Whenever you mention that, it literally blows my mind. Again, if I start doing it, I can't have these conversations without doing a conversion back to rand. It just, I'm like, my brain is fried. It just doesn't compute. It's just, and that actually goes back to the conversation we're having right at the beginning of this call around what we charge locally and then charge internationally, because at that $23, I think the exchange rate, we gained some ground against the US dollar recently. So I think it's just around 17 rand to the US dollar currently. So let's call that, 400 rand around there, somewhere around there, just over, probably about 400 rand for minimum wage. I know some,
Is that what minimum wage is in South Africa?
No, nowhere near. What I was going to compare that to, I know some small marketing agencies, so agencies delivering services that would, your fee to them would be around 400 rand an hour. You could probably actually get less, and that's them delivering their services to you. So that's certainly not a minimum wage kind of level in South Africa. In South Africa, and again, this takes us down a completely different road. You cannot survive off our minimum wage. So it is hence the reason that we have got, the problem that we do with people not having housing, people unable to afford decent housing, the conditions that people generally have to live in. Just because I've met individuals driving, Uber drivers, who I always love striking up conversation with Uber drivers, and generally a lot of them will be working 3 or 4 jobs. I met a lady in Johannesburg a few months ago, and I got chatting to her, and she has a couple of kids. One of her children's at university, one of her kids is at high school. She said to me they both don't work, and she was driving an Uber. She had just come from a full night shift at a hospital. She was still in her night shift gear, so she just came from a full night shift. I don't know how safe it is to pick me up after a full night shift, but anyway, so a full night shift. Then she was driving the Uber, and on the side, she was a bit of an entrepreneur where she was buying and selling firewood and then delivering firewood to a lot of other entrepreneurs who had these little stations on the side of the road where they cook meat and vegetables and that sort of thing. So she was doing these 3 jobs, and she said to me, I'm still struggling just to survive. So anyway, I'm ranting now, but it does. Every time you bring that up, I'm like, man, it's a different world. It's a different world.
So so if you're telling me that 400 rand is the equivalent to what a grocery store worker makes in the US, but I could hire a marketing agency per hour for that in South Africa. That's a clue as to why, I just hired a VA in the Philippines. I have another VA in Sri Lanka. And then we have another one. I can't even keep up with what countries, but I have more and more staff outside of the US now than inside the US. And this is why. I mean, it has to, because your dollar is going to go farther. And I think it helps everyone, right? Because that way it spreads some of the wealth to other countries that the US has.
Yeah. That's why
it's
that's what we call a global economy, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it truly is becoming. I did just Google South African minimum wage now because I didn't know what it was. And it is actually terrible. If this is correct, 27 Rand and 58 cents per hour. So roughly $1.
$1, $1 per hour.
Roughly $1
minimum wage in South Africa.
Yeah.
And so these would be what? So same types of jobs like grocery store, fast food, that type of thing?
Generally, a lot of those, and you won't be able to survive off of that. And look, a lot of those public, a lot of those private types of businesses, they will set their minimum wage. But where people are just like, I suppose when a business can't afford it, I've got to be careful what I say here. When a business can't afford it and people are heartless to a degree, they'll just be like, that's the minimum wage. And when we've got I know that the stats, let's call it a 50, I'm going to be kind, let's call it a 50% unemployment rate. There are people lining up for work. Like,
oh my God, that's crazy.
Yeah,
50% unemployment.
Different conversation. All right,
Man.
Jeez.
Okay, how do we wrap this up? What takeaways do we want our listeners to get from this conversation?
Yeah, what takeaways?
Well, let me ask you this, Justin. This is kind of before we jump into that, kind of a tangent. Do you ever think about you wanting to move to the US?
Yeah, they're moments. They're absolutely moments. I think one of the big reasons that one would, there are a couple of reasons. There are often security concerns or safety concerns living in South Africa. So crime is just something that we deal with, although touch wood, I've never had a major issue. So that would be one. But then just the opportunity that comes with an economy in a country the size of yours, with the number of people, it's, particularly for somebody with an entrepreneurial mindset, it's enticing. It is enticing, that thought. And I think there's, not having spent a lot of time in the US myself, but there's a place for everybody. Every state is so different. It's like a different country. So whether it's the climate, and if you're wanting big city, if you're wanting more rural or anything of that nature, it seems that there's something for everyone in the US. So yes, but then the big thing that always comes back to is leaving family. So getting to the US is, it is a long way. So leaving family is a big call. And despite everything that I've said around the crime and all of that, we live an incredible lifestyle in South Africa. And I mean, you would have seen it very briefly when you visited. And what was it, the beginning of this year? Was it last year?
It was last year, last April.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you would have seen it. We are incredibly lucky with the lifestyle that we get to live here. Our climate is amazing. South Africans as a people are wonderful people, very friendly, very engaging. So yeah, we've got so much going. And I suppose what also keeps one here is a lot of hope that our country is going to turn the corner. We've put up with we had to deal with a lot. We're a very resilient nation because over the last, we've all heard the stories globally, but over the last 30 years, 50 years, we've had to be incredibly, incredibly resilient as a nation. And that unifies people somewhat. It's proud to be South African. And I mean, you can live on the other side of the world and still be South African. But there's something about being South African and being in South Africa and trying to contribute to what is happening here that it's difficult to pack up and leave.
Interesting. Yeah, and perhaps that'd be a better conversation to put a pin in for a separate episode, because we know some people who've left South Africa and been expats, and I know people who've left the U.S. to live somewhere else and become expats. So, yeah, let's talk about that on another episode. I guess my takeaway that I would like to leave people with for this conversation, since we are in times of economic uncertainty and high price sensitivity, if you're a business owner, definitely be aware of it. So maybe you could offer some incentives or discounts or sales or promotions to get more people shopping. And on the other side of it, think about your payroll, your expenses. You may be able to leverage some of that by tapping into other countries where you can get very, very talented, experienced workers who are going to do a great job for you, but at a fraction of the price you would pay in the US. But it also means a lot financially to those people.
Yep. I don't know if I can add too much to that. I think you nailed it. Just one additional thing would be crystal clear on the pain points that you are solving for your customer. Mm-hmm. The conversation around price becomes a very difficult one for the buyer to push back on if the pain or the problem that you're solving for them is a real one. So make sure that's clearly articulated, and I think that will hopefully downplay and assist in having those regular conversations around price sensitivity.
Because then you see the ROI if you solve the problem, right?
There we go.
That's a wrap for today's episode of Kingspiration. We hope this conversation sparked insights to ignite action in your life and business.
We're on this journey together, sharing our challenges and successes to help all of us take the next step towards building momentum and ultimately reaching our goals.
If you found value in today's episode, please share it with someone else who might benefit and leave us a 5-star review.
And remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss out on our weekly conversations. Until next time, keep rolling, keep growing, and keep being inspired.